I think that what would be really interesting to keep in mind as we go through today is what is it that you're hearing that is new and fresh that prompts you to think and perhaps act differently. Okay? So without further delay, I think it would be really nice to introduce Tadhg. And I've heard Tadhg speak before, and his insight and his passion is really exciting to hear. He's a futurist. He works with both, let me just see this, UCD, School of Law and Government, and he's also an expert advisor to Futures Forum in Finland. And he describes himself as a systems scientist, futurist, and ecological economist, working on transformations to sustainable futures. So he's very well placed, and we're very honored to have him join us this afternoon and speak to us. So I will hand over to you, Tadhg, whenever you're ready. Tadhg, we can't quite hear you there. We can see your screen, but we can't hear you.
Apologies, you can hear me now?
We can hear you now.
I had muted myself, that ever-present when it comes to Zoom and Teams. Thanks so much for that generous introduction. I'm really interested in this organization and its attempts to bring more systems thinking to Ireland. I think it's an absolutely critical topic, not just an interesting one. I'm going to hopefully explain a little bit more why that is in terms of current challenges. To clarify, so it's DCU, School of Law and Government I'm currently with, and of course I'm appearing here at what I say is my own views. I am a research fellow on Ireland's climate change assessment, specifically volume 4, realizing the benefits and opportunities of transformation. But what I say here today is my own views. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the role of systems thinking in transformations generally, and a little bit of specifics around spatial planning and transport links. So something that's very topical this week, because 2 days ago we had the IPCC 6th assessment report. They released their synthesis, which is the kind of summary of knowledge across the 3 volumes: climate science, climate impacts, and emissions mitigation, short and long-term emissions reductions. I'm putting this in here because I think it bears repeating, just to get it out of the way. The change in the climate is unequivocal. It has already happened. The widespread adverse impacts are also unequivocal, have also happened. They will accelerate further into the future unless we have deep transformative change globally. So this is an existential crisis. Those are some of the key takeaways. Now, you don't want to just frighten people. There's also much cause for hope, and this is where we need to be focusing on. But we must treat it like a crisis. That means everything must go, everything must change. We must change how we think, do, and act. We must change how we analyze, how we conceptualize, how we make policy, the policies we make, and how we pursue them. The 20th century approaches to all of the above will not lead us to sustainable, livable futures. So we can limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius over the course of the century, but we will need rapid and deep transformation of systems to do this. And that requires sustainable development pathways. I'm going to focus a little bit on what they are as we go through. To focus again on the positive, transformation can deliver a far better world. The kind of framing you'd be looking at in terms of this is things like flourishing human well-being in nature, that we live far better lives. And this is to go beyond the limits of the approaches we've had in the 20th century, which are based on economic growth, high consumption and high production, which are not focusing on fundamentally what well-being is. It's an indirect focus that's coming with huge social, economic, and environmental costs. So those are some of the key takeaways, I think, that maybe give us a little bit of background for considering transformation and systems thinking. The early research on mitigation of emissions, and by early research I'm talking about 30 years and more ago, focused very, very strongly on technological change up until about the year 2000 globally, focused very, very much on economic models. And this focused us a lot on costs. So it actually contributed to delay because we had more of a focus on costs rather than what we could gain. And it's really strongly pointed to now that there's much gains in development terms, in well-being terms, in sustainability terms, in terms of nature. But we will not get at this by focusing on technology and costs alone. So that priority on technology has essentially meant that we have rising emissions globally and nationally in Ireland. We prioritized technology to lead us to what we regarded as progressive development. It has had limited benefits, mostly for a minority of the very wealthiest in the global north, and some in the economic elites of the developing countries. If you could consider the safe pair of hands in the 20th century was regarded as who would actually protect economic growth, who would deliver this to us. But we must now recognize that upholding that development path, that safe pair of hands that upheld the institutions, the markets, the structures that have led to high emissions paths, though that what was perceived as a safe pair of hands is now running us off a cliff. So we really need to look very deeply at ourselves, look in the mirror and understand where things have gone wrong and where we need to change. A watershed for this was the IPCC special report on emission scenarios, which said that to lead to sustainable development, to move towards low emissions futures, we must have technological change, but we must also have shifts in development paths. And this is where it becomes more complex. The confidence in the conclusion on the need for sustainable development paths grew to the different IPCC assessment reports, right up as far as AR6, which the mitigation report was released just last year. Global modeling has evolved, but is typically still more focused on technological change, and especially so in Ireland. What is a sustainable development path? Starting to link this more with systems thinking. First of all, it's multidimensional. Second of all, it considers transforming system structures and technology, not just the end of pipe, not just the technology at the end, not just the renewable energies and the electric vehicles. It requires diverse knowledge frameworks, so that means bottom-up and top-down processes. It means inter and transdisciplinary frameworks that not only include economics, technology, and engineering, but also critically the social sciences and humanities. A definition of the development paths was given by the IPCC fourth assessment report, which kind of points to there's critical aspects to this in terms of social, cultural, political, institutional. We also need to platform nature, ecosystems, the natural systems that we depend on for all of the processes that that allow us to survive and allow the economy to function. And this is at different scales and across all countries. This is an interesting figure that was published 2 days ago in the synthesis report of the IPCC sixth assessment report. If you look at the bottom, you're looking at high growth, emissions intensive production and consumption pathways, prioritizing well-being based on high consumption, not working enough on inequality, not working enough on structures and systems change, but for prioritizing technology and economic growth. If you look to the top, this is where it gets far more interesting. This is where you move to sustainable development paths. And sustainable development paths can deliver far more synergies. So that would be things like public health, mental well-being, physical well-being, the resilience, enhancement of nature, and systems that function more efficiently and that prioritize our own goals as societies to a higher level, rather than the 20th century focus on economic growth as correcting all ills, when it is actually a mega driver behind the current sustainability crisis we have. I'm going to just briefly focus on two of the really important parts that come through from that graph. On the right-hand side, if you can see, these sustainable development paths are low emissions because they directly facilitate technology to reduce emissions. And that's why they're critical. You still need technology, but you must facilitate this by systems that allow you to actually decarbonize and remove emissions from systems. That means agriculture, it means food, it means transport, it means industry, it means working in systems and structures that are inherently less emissions and material intensive. And that requires transformation. It lowers the climate risk. It involves working on equity and justice. But in terms of synergies, it also means you achieve far more of SDGs as one of the frameworks to look at this. On the left-hand side, I'll point you towards, this includes inclusive governance, so different scales that you do actually have, effective dialogue that does bring the thoughts and perspectives and worldviews, and Pender is going to speak a little bit about this later, of the different groups to the table, finding out commonalities, finding ways of reaching synergies and managing trade-offs. It respects diverse knowledges and values. It doesn't only prioritize economics, technology, and engineering, but particularly platforms, social sciences and humanities, and understands that there are different value systems that we need to include in this. Other important elements, of course, again, are that this leads to far more synergies across things that are really important to us. Cleaning up our air, cleaning up our water, healthier food, resilience, food security, prioritizing our well-being, prioritizing nature. It encompasses behavioral change, but we must also remember that behavioral change is situated within systems. So we must also change things like infrastructures, policies, and social cultural factors. The IPCC have, so that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that released the synthesis report just this week, have been really central to platforming systems thinking in terms of sustainability and in terms of climate action, leading to deep reduction in emissions. The fourth assessment report noted the inability of normal disciplinary science to deal with complexity in systems, i.e. the challenges of sustainability, because sustainability is irreducible and holistic. So it requires a lens that is transdisciplinary and synthetic. So effectively, systems thinking is not an approach to understand transformations to low emissions futures. It is the approach. Now, it is a broad church that encompasses many different ways of looking holistically at systems. But what it would have in common is diverse disciplines, multiple value perspectives, thinking about different possible pathways into the future. What are those plausible pathways and what are desirable pathways? So systems thinking is about transformation to a better world in terms of systems thinking for transformation. It is more complex to do this rather than just focusing on technology. But an important outcome from the Working Group 3 report of the IPCC assessment report that came out last year was compelling evidence that current development pathways will not achieve rapid and deep emissions reductions. And in the absence of shifts in pathways, conventional mitigation policy, i.e. technology and carbon pricing, may not be able to limit emissions or only at very high economic and social costs. So again, we need systems thinking and we need system and structural transformation to lead to low emissions futures. But this is about a better world. There are many, many synergies that have come through in the analytical literature once you go to these deeper system and structural transformations. And it limits and helps you to manage trade-offs. The graph or the figure that I've included at the right-hand side kind of gives us a picture on what that involves. Early in research on reducing emissions, known as mitigation, it was about looking at mitigation alone only, which was dominated by technology. After that, it became about looking at co-benefits, other aspects of sustainable development and equity. But in the last 20 years, it has very strongly moved towards pointing out that we need to move to development pathways, choosing a pathway, taking all relevant objectives into account at the same time. That's a political process, but those different aspects, social, cultural, political, institutional, technological, environmental, infrastructural, system, structural, they need to be included in our analysis so that we can enable our politicians to actually make decisions based on an understanding of different pathways, and that the public can engage with the need for systems change, that there's some things they can do in terms of behavioral change, but the changing of systems top down is critical also. It's not enough to just do behavior. You need to be looking at things like spatial patterns and transport systems, which we're going to come to shortly. The IPCC, again, the same chapter, Michel Flourbet, the lead author on that in the fifth assessment report, moving towards what this means, that we need to be doing a reconceptualization, platforming human well-being, characterizing what it is in different countries. And we do have initiatives in Ireland and in other countries to now do this, to prioritize the importance of equity, the importance of social justice within this, maintaining a social contract so that all people can have the opportunity to live a flourishing, good life, but also that people can get on board with the deep systems change that we're going to have to do if we're going to achieve deep emissions reductions. And also the importance of nature and environmental conservation. So this involves changing our priority goals based on this reconceptualization, then changing the policy we do. So not just climate policy in terms of things like electric vehicles or renewables, but development policies on inherently lower emissions path, and lower emissions branches of the economy, such as services, are often prioritized, or industries, economic sectors that actually improve the environment, that actually, of course, reduce emissions, and that can lead you towards sustainable development paths. I put up here quickly something that branched actually from that chapter, an article that I published last year on towards sustainable well-being, which kind of brings together the systems thinking, including nature, with the contemporary theories of well-being, and it is somewhat of a pioneering approach internationally, and was quite difficult for me to actually finish. But it allows us to kind of start looking at how we can prioritize characterizing what well-being is, because well-being is usually poorly characterized in sustainability, and then moving that through our reconceptualizations down to as far as changing sustainable development paths, which it refers to in the conclusion. So systems thinking for transformation being about a better world. We actually know the solutions to arriving at low emissions and outcomes. We know a lot about the technology. We know that's technologically and economically feasible. We globally know much less about the structure and systems changes, partly because the dominance of models that only look at technologies has kind of pushed this off, partly because of too much of a dominance sometimes by economists and technologists in these conversations. But also because there are certain vested interests don't want us to look at these solutions because it's not in their in the interest of their short-term profit. Nationally, we have even less knowledge of this in terms of really transformative systems and structural changes. I'm going to point to this a little bit later on spatial and in terms of the case study on spatial settlement and transport. More important than the model we use. Models are really, really important, and they will continue to be important. But more important than the models we use are the assumptions we apply. What things do we take for granted? Are they business as usual economic growth paths? Do they involve acknowledgement of different conceptual frameworks? Do they acknowledge structural uncertainty? Do they look at systems and structural change, or just that end of pipe technology? That's absolutely critical to understanding transformational pathways, because model results are an artifact of the kind of models you use and the assumptions you put in. So the results are effectively artifacts of how the studies are constructed. So it is critical that we use different scenarios into the future. Otherwise, we re-embed and reproduce the business as usual dynamics which have got us into the trouble in the first place. So we need to analyze scenarios of deep systems and structure change, not just business as usual technology change. This is global, but very, very important in Ireland because we have very little work. In terms of moving to that example of sustainable mobility transformation in Ireland, we must first note that we have very high transport emissions per capita because we have sprawling systems of settlement and car dependency. People sometimes say, well, we're a country of low population density, but that's because of policy choices in spatial planning over decades. We also have other countries like Finland, which has about a quarter of the population density of Ireland, but does far better on transport emissions per capita. So we have the double whammy of both sprawling settlements, low density suburbs, ribbon development, and one-off housing that is also hollowing out our towns and villages. So there's a significant negative impact on rural Ireland. And we have this car dependency, which is linked to that and has been prioritized by decades of running down public transport, running down active transport. Even when I was growing up in the 1980s, a lot of people walked and cycled, and that fell off. 100 years ago, rail dominated transport in Ireland. That was allowed to drop off. And from the 70s onwards, we prioritized motorways. This is what's fundamentally behind our high emissions path in Ireland, and why we are a laggard and why we need to transform. So the early attempts to reduce emissions in Ireland in terms of analysis and policy concentrated on a kind of efficiencies, things like smaller engines, biodiesel, and later electric vehicles. It was pointed out for more than a decade ago, and in actually a study that I published in 2013, IPCC later referenced, and actually came from my PhD, that we need to look at scale structural intensity effects. So that's the transformation. That's the avoid, shift, improve approach, ASI. Later in 2019, things did begin to shift. It was a long wait for this to happen. Essentially, the policy for climate action just sat within the Department of Transport, and the Department of Transport decided that they would prioritize energy efficiency and carbon efficiency. From 2019, this began to change through work that was that I platformed at the Climate Change Advisory Council and at the EPA. Later studies from the likes of a colleague of mine, Brian Caulfield, and Hannah Daly, involved in the paper by Gora et al. Published last year from UCC, is now starting to push on how we can understand avoid, shift, improve in Ireland. The government's climate action plan then went for relying on almost exclusively on improve. So basically reducing or improving energy and carbon efficiency, just substantially platforming avoid, shift, improve in 2022. But the policy is still incoherent, and I'll explain why that is in a moment. And significant gaps in knowledge remain for us to move forward. The finger is now being pointed at spatial planning and at transport planning. This is a necessary first step, but now we must be able to start articulating answers. So we need studies within spatial planning and transport planning that allow the energy models to do better energy modeling, and that allow our policies to become more fully informed in what we can do in terms of spatial and transport planning. To give it just
sorry, Ty, you're just over 20 minutes there now, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, I'm literally at the end here.
Great,
thanks for that reminder. So this slide is just a very, very brief introduction to that avoid, shift, improve. So avoid is about things like spatial planning for compact and dense settlement. The national planning framework is not going to be enough. It just slightly bends the curve of the sprawl we have. It doesn't say, it hasn't actually looked at what it would look like spatially into the future if we were to stop that urban sprawl, reinvigorate in towns or in villages, and work on compact development in our cities. Our transport planning, active modes, walking and cycling, and public transport. It's critical that we look at these. They have been hugely demoted in our race towards car dependency and prioritizing motorways. And then also we still need to do the energy efficiency. That the vehicles we do have, we improve their the energy you use and remove the fossil fuels. Just a very, very brief point to where these gaps in knowledge lie. This is some work I did for the Climate Change Advisory Council that came through in their annual review in 2021. You can see here in terms of where the gaps in knowledge are. We have knowledge on energy efficiency and carbon efficiency. So basically slightly changing our vehicles. We have knowledge on carbon pricing. We have essentially nothing on walking, cycling, and rail, bus. There's particular things you can do with that even in rural areas that have been successful in other countries. And then on the links between spatial planning and mitigation potential or future emissions, we essentially know very, very little. And this is really hampering where we can go. Thank you so much for listening. The questions and comments will be very welcome. I've popped up here just in case anybody's interested in that paper I wrote on sustainable well-being and bringing well-being and sustainability together. And thanks so much for your time today.
Okay, thanks so much, Tadhg. There's just so much in what you're saying there. And we will keep questions until later. But I think what you're describing is just so important in terms of how do we platform different issues and begin to move away from the economic and the technological framing and the models that we're looking at, because they simply don't work and focus on well-being. And I think when you're talking about as well that we have the solutions and we know if we were all asked what it is that we would like to be better about our lives and how much more sustainable everything could be. I think that maybe Anne can give us some clues coming up next about how is it that we can begin to make that transformation, because it's one that is, you know, we all have a responsibility to move through and be part of, no matter where we find ourselves on the system. So thank you so much. There's just so much there. I'll just pass over to Anne now, though, to pick up the baton and begin to hold on. I'm just going to spotlight you there, Anne, and hand over to you. Okay, so thank you, Tadhg.
Lovely. Thanks, John. Just adjust the screen here. Thanks, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. As Tadhg said, for me also, my views are my own. I'm working with UCD and I also work for myself as a consultant. What I'll talk about today is, firstly, this idea of transformation. How do we understand it? How do we approach it, particularly in relation to climate action? And then I'll talk a little bit about inner dimensions of transformative action, particularly the role that our worldviews play in how we understand and how we respond to the climate crisis. I only have a couple of slides to share. I'll be keeping an eye on my presentation so I keep myself on time. So I thought to start with, for me, a key thing that we need to understand and appreciate is that human-induced climate change is as much a cultural and a social phenomenon as it is an environmental one, because the causes and the solutions lie with humans, individually and collectively. The difficulty has been that most of the dominant responses that we've had, and Tadhg outlined some of those, have really failed to account for this social and cultural dimension. Things like worldviews, values, beliefs, assumptions that shape how we understand and respond to the challenge. And there's a very good quote from the late systems theorist Donella Meadows, and she talks about paradigms, these sort of ways that we have collectively of understanding the nature of our world and reality. And she said, paradigms are the sources of systems. From shared social agreements about the nature of reality come system goals, information, feedbacks, stocks, flows, and everything else about systems. They influence the kinds of systems that we get and how well those systems work. So when we talk about transforming our systems, system change is really not possible unless we are changing our worldviews, our institutions, and our technologies together as an integrated system. We've done a lot of practical things in a sort of disjointed manner, but they're not necessarily coordinated and recognizing that they need to shift systems. And we're not recognizing that to shift the systems, we need to shift ourselves. The one model that I use a lot in my work to understand this integrated nature of transformation and this sort of systemic perspective is called the three spheres. And it sees transformation as a process that takes place across three elements that are embedded in each other and are interconnecting. So I'll just share one slide on that. Let me just share my screen here. And here we go. So this is a diagram showing these practical, political, and personal spheres or aspects of transformation. And when we only work in one of them on their own, we're not going to get that integrated shift that we need. We need to be trying to address all three together. So when we talk about the practical sphere that we can see in the center, we're looking at basically things like behavior change, technical solutions, reforming our institutions to try and address climate change. And we've seen a lot of that happening in the responses we've had to date. When we move to the political sphere, we're talking about our governance systems, our cultural and social norms, our political and institutional structures that create the conditions for the actions that happen in the political and in the practical sphere. And I have an example of that in a moment. So what we can do practically is constrained or enabled by what we design politically and systemically. But then moving out beyond that, we will see with the personal sphere, this is where we're looking at our individual and shared beliefs, values, paradigms, and worldviews, because this sphere firstly shapes the way that our systems and structures are understood and designed. And in that way, then influences what types of practical solutions are considered possible or desirable or not, as the case may be. So one of the examples that I would have for that would be with food waste. When we see that food waste is comprising about 8 to 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions, the kinds of practical responses we've had to that would be things like getting households to reduce the amount of food waste that they generate, looking at composting food waste, reusing food that's nearly going off in supermarkets and repurposing that. Absolutely important to do, but they won't be successful unless we have political sphere change to support that, such as food waste collection systems like brown bins, reusing stock from supermarkets to be used elsewhere, like the Irish company Food Cloud that's been really successful at doing that. Rethinking best before dates, use before dates, which we're actually seeing happening right now. And then moving back to sort of the personal sphere actions. People won't reuse leftover food unless we get rid of the stigma about leftovers. But it's very recent in Ireland that it's acceptable to take home what you don't eat from a restaurant and to ask for that to be packaged. We didn't do that 10 years ago. So that's been a really positive thing. But again, it's the stigma of asking for that has gone to a certain extent, so it's made that possible. We also need to give people an incentive to do it. We can tell them that it's a good thing to reuse leftovers or to avoid your food waste. But if we don't give them an incentive to do that, why will you bother? For example, is there a financial savings to be made? That can often be a good entry point into helping shift people's perspectives. So what I want to do for the rest of what we're talking about here is to focus on this personal sphere, because particularly for how it shapes the systems that we get and how it drives both the transformations in the systems and also the types of practical actions that we can get going on the ground to actually address climate change effectively. Excuse me. And basically, we start from the point that whenever we act, whatever we do, we are motivated and influenced by what goes on in our heads, our desires, our motivations, our emotions. We don't act without some kind of inner drive. I'm going to talk particularly about worldviews and how they shape our understanding of climate action. And a quote that I really like to use that sort of captures how worldviews influence systems actually comes from that classic book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. It was such a cool book to have when I was a teenager. We never read it, we just carried it around. But one of the quotes in it is really good. It says, if a factory is torn down, but the rationality which produced it is left standing, then that rationality will simply produce another factory. If a revolution destroys a government, but the systemic patterns of thought that produce that government are left intact, then those patterns will repeat themselves. So we're getting the underlying motivations, paradigms, etc., influencing the patterns of action, the design of our systems, and the practical actions on the ground. So what are worldviews? I like to think of worldviews as really the lenses through which we see and filter reality around us, how we make meaning from the world. I particularly in my work use a developmental psychology perspective, where studies in psychology have shown that there's actually a distinct structure and sequence to the way that we come to understand and make meaning of the world and our place in it. And that actually has the potential to evolve and deepen through our lifespan from birth to adulthood. There's a lovely quote from the American philosopher and writer Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he said, "Our life is an apprenticeship to the truth that around every circle another can be drawn, that there is no end in nature, but every end is a beginning, and under every deep, a lower deep opens." I'll be using quite a few quotes because I really like bringing other aspects into my work, and that's something I'll talk a little bit about at the end as well. So how we understand the world, the type of worldview that we hold, and I'll explore a few of those in a few minutes. Each worldview is like a building block of our capacity to understand and engage with the world. It's like as we grow, we develop, we generate more rungs on our ladder. Each worldview is essential. It's like a piece of the puzzle to understanding reality in as complex and systemic a way as possible. But they're partial. No one worldview has all the answers. So that sort of phrase, partial but essential, is one I like to use. Absolutely, later worldviews are not necessarily better than earlier ones. A good example is with children. They don't have the capacity to understand complex systems, but they do have the capacity to engage with systems and embody systems in a way that many adults can't. And the Indian philosopher Krishnamurti has a really nice quote about this. He says, "The children were playing about, but they never looked at that lovely spring day. They had no need, for they were spring. Their laughter and their play were part of the tree, the leaf, and the flower." And if you've ever watched a child engrossed in their play, they're in that world. They're not sort of looking at that world or thinking about that world. They're in that world. So each worldview has value, but has partiality. So when we're looking at responding to problems and responding to complex problems that need a systemic approach, the question that's really good to ask is this worldview a good fit for the task at hand? Or do we need more? Do we need a more complex perspective? I'll share one diagram here that sort of gives an idea of this sort of spiral or sequential nature of our worldviews. I just need to make that bigger. Sorry, 1 second now. Make the slideshow here. From the current slide, and I'll just move it to there. 1 second now. There we go. Let me go back and share that. Sorry, it works well and then it doesn't work well. Here we go. So this is a diagram that takes one particular sequence of worldviews. The terminology is a little bit different than some of the ones I use. I've just highlighted on the right-hand side the 5 that I'll talk about. There's conformist, expert achiever, and then pluralist and strategist. The key thing to see is that there's a big shift kind of through our development where we move from this sort of rational, fact-based understanding of the world to acquiring wisdom. And it's where I see that's where that sort of complexity and that capacity for systems thinking actually arises. We're not born with it. It's something that we have the potential to develop if we have the necessary supporting conditions, that we live in sort of comparative security, that we've got access to good education, that we have financial security. These kind of things can actually hold us back in developing a more systemic understanding of the world. I just mentioned I have a PDF of the slides that I've given Joan, so these will be in it. And there's another diagram actually about different worldviews that we look at. So what I want to do now is to go through the 5 most common worldviews that we see in the global population. Together, they're comprising about 90% of the adult population. The figure is kind of varying, and explain kind of, if we're looking at the world through that worldview's particular lens, this is how we understand and respond to climate change. So one of the most common ones is what we call kind of manager conformist. And this is where we see a priority in climate action for reducing emissions through top-down institutional reform. using regulation, using scientific expertise, a lot of what we've had already. It's good for keeping the show on the road, as I like to say, but it's not a great worldview for if we need radical change in structures and systems or values. A lot of government institutions and agencies would have and are built on a conformist culture. And as I say, they're good for the day-to-day and keeping things solid and being the basis of democracy and having functioning systems. But they're not, they don't, with that worldview, you don't necessarily have the capacity for that more radical understanding and appetite for change. So as we move with conformist, you're probably seeing teenagers, late teens into early 20s is when you kind of start developing that kind of perspective. Evolving through that, we would come into the expert, what we call the expert worldview. And this is where we have a focus on rules, expertise, factual knowledge, which has been really important in generating the scientific and technical knowledge and understanding that we now have on climate change. We absolutely needed that. We still need it. We need better models. We need to understand what we're doing. The difficulty is, and some of the limitations here would be, it tends to focus a lot on practical sphere actions and technology. The tech fix is a classic expert response. And again, it's important. It's a piece of the puzzle, but it's not the only thing that we need. And we also see in terms of climate communications, this sort of what I call the information deficit approach, that if we just tell people what to do, that will be enough and that will shift behavior. And I mean, I did this myself. I was involved in the protest movement for a long time. And you just thought if we just explain it properly to people, they will understand and they will change their behavior. And it's a part of the puzzle, but it's not sufficient on its own. So moving through expert worldview, we come into what's called the achiever worldview, where we really start to value freedom, individual rights, self-interest, achievement. And again, this has fueled a lot of our innovation. A lot of our successful companies are led by people who work from this, and that gets us a lot of the innovation that we need. But the preference, because there is that value on rights and freedom, we see a preference there for market-based solutions. The market will solve everything. So emissions trading, carbon taxation, technological innovation. And again, that definitely has a role to play, but it's not going to be the only solution that works. We're still really looking at it, working in the context of reform when we're in this worldview, rather than radically transforming. Because the status quo suits a lot of achievers. It really does. We see that with particularly the billionaire club. Their careers and their wealth has been built using this perspective, so they don't really have an incentive to change. And when there's that conflict between change and profits, they may have lip service to sort of acting sustainably, but when the rubber hits the road, as they say, they will go for the profits. And we see that with the backlash about greenwashing at the moment. That's really highlighting a lot of that, that lip service. We expand our time horizon when we're here. We can see sort of medium term and plan a bit longer than expert or conformist, which is helpful. And then moving into pluralist worldview, this is where we see a capacity emerging to understand the systemic and interconnected nature of the world. We understand that things, if we change something here, it will have an impact. Our ecosystems understanding of the world came from this a lot of the time. We see a motivation to act because we care about people and the planet. We're open to more radical alternatives for climate change solutions. A lot of young people, we would see, actually, there's some evidence now that younger people are moving into a pluralist worldview earlier than previous generations did. And one of the drivers seems to be the climate crisis, that it's actually pushing them to develop psychologically to actually understand the systemic nature of the world earlier than previous generations had to do. One of the difficulties or the limitations still is that up to pluralists and including pluralists, we tend to think that the way we understand the world is the way the world is, and the way that everybody else should understand the world. And that's a limitation because we will disagree, because people don't see the world in the same way. And we're not necessarily able to appreciate the value of other perspectives. So I've kind of galloped a little bit through those. So to go on to the next slide here, I'm just keeping an eye on my slides to keep on track. With the fifth one,
Sorry,
that I
Anne, that's
work
your
with,
2-minute warning there.
yeah, perfect. 2 minutes, yeah. With strategists, the next level, we really get into systemic understanding. We know that transformation is not just about change out there, it's about changing inside us. We have the ability to think long term, we can hold systemic and interdisciplinary working, and we can work on multiple scales. The bad news is we're at about 5% of the global population that's really working from a strategist worldview, but it's growing and it is changing. A little bit behind, so I'll gallop through one of these. The main takeaway is that if we're working with transformation, one of the key capacities is understanding and integrating multiple perspectives. So if we can get to the understanding that different worldviews are partial but essential, we can start designing responses that combine the values of each worldview so people can see themselves in the responses that we're designing. And we're trying to avoid conflict. It's one way that the arts are really helpful, the way the social sciences are also really helpful, because they can help us look at the world in these different lenses. The additional systems, the additional information that we don't see when we only look at it from an expert worldview or a scientific worldview. Some of you may be familiar with the concept of warm data from Nora Bateson. That will be one perspective of looking at the world in a slightly different way. I have a little piece I want to leave you with. I'm going to run over by about 2 minutes, please. That just looks at a tree from these integrated perspectives. So I'll just read that and I'll leave you with that. Let me just switch over to it. So it's by the philosopher Martin Buber. He wrote this in about 1923, so he was really forward thinking. And he said, I consider a tree. I can look on a tree as a picture, stiff column in a shock of light, or splash of green shot with the delicate blue and silver of the background. I can perceive it as movement, flowing veins on clinging, pressing pith, stuck of the roots, breathing of the leaves, ceaseless commerce with earth and air, and the obscure growth itself. I can classify it in a species and study it as a type in its structure and mode of life. I can subdue its actual presence and form so sternly that I recognize it only as an expression of laws in accordance with which a constant opposition of forces is constantly adjusted. I can dissipate it and perpetuate it in number, in pure numerical relation. In all this, the tree remains my object, occupies space and time, and has its nature and constitution. It can, however, come about that if I have both will and grace, that in considering the tree, I become bound up in relation to it. Then the tree is no longer it. I have been seized by the power of exclusiveness. To do this, it is not necessary for me to give up any of the ways in which I considered the tree. There is nothing from which I would have to turn my eyes away in order to see, and no knowledge that I would have to forget. Rather, is everything, picture and movement, species and type, law and number, indivisibly united in this event. Everything belonging to the tree is in this. Its form and structure, colors and chemical composition, its relation with the elements and with the stars are all present in a single whole. The tree is no impression, no play of my imagination, no value depending on my mood, but it is bodied over and against me and has to do with me as I with it, only in a different way. Let no attempt be made to sap the strength from the meaning of the relation. Relation is mutual. Thank you.
I think, Anne, with that, we're all in pause and absorption. Thank you so much. I should have mentioned before I introduced Anne, and it seems rather crass thing to do now, but I think it is important as well, that you are an environmental policy design fellow in the School of Architecture and Planning and Environmental Policy in UCD, as well as being involved in the bioeconomy policy in the Bioorbic Bioeconomy Science Foundation of Ireland Research Centre. And that seems to be quite juxtaposed with your what you've just read out for us. But I think it's essential, actually, that we are and that we grow and that we build these new planes as we are flying them, and that we, you know, reimagine our relationships and the relational dynamic between us and nature. And as Tadhg mentioned as well, social sciences, well-being and sustainability.
Absolutely. And I struggled for a long time to be able to bring those pieces together, because I was constantly told, you can't do that. You can't reference poetry in your dissertation. You can't quote X. You can't bring those together. And it just always felt to me a natural thing to do. I was like, well, why can't I? And I never got a satisfactory answer. So I just kept persisting. So it's finally starting to come together.
Okay. And I think what's really interesting about your model as well, and it really speaks to what Tadhg is talking about, is that I'm used to person-centered models where all the structures go around and point at the person in the center, who is an object and is objectified and is like a tree completely disembodied and disconnected from its context. And what you're talking about is that this personal space is the ground, and that's the ground that needs some transformation. But I won't go on because I could talk to you both for hours about this, but I'm not the only person here. So Aisling, do we have any questions in the chat? And does anybody want to ask anything? So
we've a question here from Louise, which I will put here. Really interesting to hear the presentations. In what ways do you think you both see systems thinking or systems in the same way and or differently? How and or hinder how we relate to this topic? Maybe you, Anne, first, since you're still on screen, if that's not putting you on the spot too much.
No, it's fine. I would see a lot of resonances. I think when Tadhg is talking about well-being and those positive aspects of pursuing addressing climate crisis, but also how that can really lead to thriving. And that's a word I really like to use, that the current systems don't work for anybody, be they human or natural. They're not giving us what we really need to thrive. And some people would say that the climate crisis is almost like a wake-up call writ large to tell us this, because we haven't been listening, that there is a different way to live that is beneficial and really gets to the heart of what it means to have a thriving human life. But there are also, as Tadhg said, there are huge vested interests whom the current system serves. And uncovering that and challenging that is really difficult. And it has taken a long time. As his timeline really showed that really well. And I've been working with policy for 20 years. And before that, I was working in the protest movement. And it's been a long haul, and it's been, I think, on the one hand, things feel like they're getting worse and you feel more despondent, but on the other hand, I see more and I see progress actually starting to happen, which gives me hope. But yeah, I would see that we're tying it both to the potential for transformation to lead to thriving, if I was to sum it up.
thanks, Anne. Tadhg, would you like to add anything there?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting question. I think it came through from I can't see the name there now, but it was Louise. Okay, I know Louise, of course. That's probably why she's been challenging. I think there's a lot of commonality in terms of how we'd see systems thinking, or this is my perspective, to put it that way, in that it's holistic, it's irreducible, it's multidimensional, and requires different disciplines and requires different world views and perspectives. Systems thinking, to me, or my understanding of it, is it's a very broad church. There are particular schools you'll come across with different particular authors. You'll find it used differently in different parts of, for example, mitigation and sustainable development. So I think you need to use a particular approach to systems thinking that suits the question you have. But as Anne has also pointed to, you also need to be reflexive and reflective. You need to think about, what are we actually trying to achieve here? Am I looking at kind of alternative ways of viewing this? Am I looking at the kind of structural uncertainty, or am I just reproducing the business as usual dynamics and trends of the system as it is? If you're doing that, you are probably becoming more and more part of the problem, because you're not moving into, us to use Anne's terminology, into that strategist, pluralist and then strategist mode, to go that there are multiple ways of looking at this, and the strategy is about understanding how you can bring them together, to bring them together better as you move forward into the future. So I wouldn't say they're exactly the same. I think you can see there's a psychological focus in terms of the work that Anne is doing, but it is relational and systemic. I would say, in terms of my understanding of systems thinking, particularly with mitigation, sustainable development, there are about 5 major approaches, which include the politics, the systems, the worldviews and values, and the psychology, decision making under uncertainty, integrated assessment models. There are and systems. There are these different kind of lenses that we need. I think Anne is looking at something absolutely critical and pushing it forward for us to reflect as individuals and as communities in practice, in terms of what we're doing. In terms of answering things like how we reduce emissions, we need to do a bit of it all. We need to do that reflection on our own motivations, the change within ourselves, as well as the change within the systems. But of course, the change within ourselves is what leads to change. The change, I mean, even if you think the limitations in terms of how we've looked at how the world must be, it must be economic growth, it must be one-off housing in the countryside, it must be just some technological tweaks to actually reduce emissions. That's a culture of practice, it's a worldview, it's a way of doing things. It's something we know really at the frontier of knowledge on this for the last 20 years that it won't work. It's been very, very slow to take hold, slow globally, very, very slow in Ireland. It is starting to take off now, and I think one of the positive things in Ireland, we have a history of doing things like jobs programs, which are integrated and working across different systems levels. So we have been successful at aspects of systems thinking and transformation before. We now need to do it again, to the biggest challenge that probably humanity's ever faced.
Thanks, Tadhg. And that kind of leads us into the next question, really, from Jack. Any thoughts on how to address the multiple crises? So I suppose we have a number of them at the moment. I presume he means the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis. There's also an energy crisis and many others I'm probably not mentioning. What are your thoughts on that?
I was just looking at the chat there, and somebody else was also talking about how to get the political action. And I think the two kind of tie together, because what we're seeing in Ireland, actually, with the recent citizens' assemblies, where a cross-selection of ordinary people were brought together, given information and helped to understand what are really quite complex issues. Not only were they able to understand those, and to bring their own experiences and their own desires for a better future to that. Actually, what we saw coming out of the Citizens' Assembly on climate action, what we saw coming out of the Citizens' Assembly on the referendum that led to marriage equality and the abortion referenda, is that there's actually an appetite for much more radical action amongst the general population than at a political level. I think our politicians are often extremely conservative because they're trying to hedge their bets. And it's a downside of democracy, because you have those regular electoral cycles. But for me, I thought that's the single most important thing I think came out of the citizens' assemblies, that there actually is an appetite for radical action. And people, when they can understand that the change will result in benefits, and it's not just going to be painful. I mean, the process of getting there may be painful, but we can manage that if we are incentivized. But that, as Tadhg is pointing out, and I think that's why this concept of well-being is so important, that there's actually potential to create a better way of living, that people are open to that. Now, it needs to be supported. We've seen the difficulties in the Midlands, for example, where we're trying to move from peat-fired electricity generation. And the need for a just transition, and people feeling that really they're not being well catered for in that regard. So we have work to do. It can't just be lip service, but I feel that there is that appetite is there. That appetite is definitely there.
I completely agree with Anne. I think in terms of whether how we look at the multiple crises. I think you can pick different ones. There's has been financial crisis, economic crisis, cost of living crisis, energy crisis, climate breakdown, ecological breakdown. There's a problem for democracy. Also that comes from growing inequality and these burgeoning problems. I think the key bit is we actually have to look at them together. And you can do, this is what looking at synergies and trade-offs is about. Transformations of system and structures in addition to technology means that you must take that wider view. What are these problems? So that you can then start to understand what solutions can hit multiple points at the one time. An example would be if you decide that you're going to prioritize rail, you can potentially get rid of 80 to 90% of road traffic accidents. If you go down the route of letting that dominate again, you get rid of air quality problems, you get rid of greenhouse gas emissions, you get rid of congestion. You do have to put in capital investment, but it is about putting that lens on it that starts to understand those relationships, that broad view on the system. That's absolutely critical. The literature is telling us now for the last few years that if you go down an analysis of transformation and trying to pursue transformational policy, that the synergies far outweigh those trade-offs. You will still have trade-offs. You will have people who will have some difficulties with some of the changes. Anne pointed to, for example, the winding down of peat extraction and peat-fired electricity, but there are ways of managing that. And that's what a just transition is about. It's about bringing their voices to bear and their needs to bear and understanding they're usually very specific and contextual to particular areas and sectors. And they need to be heard and encompassed. But I'd say it's not more a problem of how do we manage all these together. We have to manage them all together, and I think that's the function of a democracy, is that we manage our country for the public good, and that we have public representatives that do that. They are moving forward, but the pace has been glacial, and it needs to change significantly. And I think if again that safe pair of hands tries to hold this back, I think people because there is that appetite for change. The example would be the housing crisis. Politicians will pay at the electorate. This is not things that we can run away from anymore. There's understanding that there are these major policy problems that need to be dealt with nationally and globally.
I would also just throw into the pot there. I just was looking at the chat again, and one person was talking about how do we get this sort of capacity at government level and policy making, and somebody else was also talking about doomerism and that sort of dystopian perspective. And I would just sort of throw in that, yes, we need sort of practical training. I think policy making needs to embrace critical thinking and systemic thinking skills. And I can see that is starting to happen. There is a recognition that those skills are actually needed for policymakers. I would also say a key starting point for bringing people together and for harnessing people's appetite is to ask people, what do they care about? Because we actually care about so much more in common than we disagree about. As human beings, we fundamentally want a lot of the same things. And I just find that a really good question, like, what do you care about? And it can be a way to diffuse the conflicts and the differing value systems. And I always find it a good place to start. But also with this idea of doomerism, I think there are two elements to it. One is there absolutely is manufactured doom, because vested interests don't want a lot of the systems to change. And I feel that is fueling a lot of the sort of catastrophe thinking and painting any kind of change as inevitably bad and as a loss. And that's suiting a particular agenda. But also I feel a certain amount of doom-led thinking comes from people who feel powerless and who feel they have no agency. It's hard to feel hopeful when you feel powerless. So again, it comes back to things like the difference that something like a citizens' assembly can make, where people feel it's not just information gathering and asking people their view, it's actually being engaged in the process. And yes, that's messier and it's more complex and it's more time consuming and it requires more resources than just having an expert make policy. But we don't need to just change the kinds of actions we have. We need to change the processes. We need to change how we make policy. And I think this is one of the elements that we've struggled with for a long time. Local government in Ireland is very weak. You look at countries like Switzerland, where they have a much better functioning local form of actual engaged local government. I think there's huge potential for that. But again, we need people to be personally motivated and want to shift those systems and to be able to have that change happen. And that comes back to then that sort of personal sphere thing of, do I believe in this? Am I open to change? So you kind of just think those linkages again.
Thanks, Anne. I see Jack O'Sullivan has his hand up. Jack, do you want to come in? And by all means, other people, before I go back to the chat, ask your questions in person if you're happy to do that.
Yeah, very, very quickly. First of all, thank you for setting this up and for two wonderful speakers, Tadhg and Anne. When I heard Tadhg talking, I thought, my God, there's someone else in Ireland thinks the same way in a kind of systems thinking. And I came across this kind of thinking way back in the early 1970s. And I remember being really excited by a man called John McHale, and then the Limits to Growth study and the Beyond the Limits. And I said earlier, can I quote from Donella Meadows? Unfortunately, she's gone from us now, but she was lovely. The way she said to solve the crisis, truth-telling, learning and loving. I thought, that's not technology. That's exactly as Anne says, the softer approach. But one problem I see in Ireland, this is where I'd love Anne and Tadhg to come in, is how do we get people to think in the wider way? I'm a member of the Public Participation Network in Westmeath County Council. Okay. And the Strategic Policy Committee. But I find that everyone, even when it comes to something as simple as some money coming into a town, everyone wants to do their own thing separately. The GA people want something. The tidy towns people want something. It is extraordinarily difficult because of our thinking that has been pushed into us for so long that we should be in competition with each other and not collaborating. The bus going to Dublin from Mullingar is in competition with the train to Dublin going from Mullingar. The Port of Cork is in competition with the Port of Waterford. We've been told by our political top people for a generation, well, for decades, compete, get out there and compete. If you're Waterford, you compete with Cork. In Sweden, the ports collaborate with each other. So we've a lot to learn from countries like Finland, Sweden, Lithuania, where I worked for a while myself. But how do you get this thinking? The Citizens' Assembly was wonderful. I think what they did, that system is beautiful. I would love to see a Citizens' Assembly in every county in Ireland. How is that for a crazy thought? Thank you.
I would absolutely agree, Jack. Citizens' assemblies are definitely a useful tool. And it's interesting what you're saying there. How do we get people to think differently? One of the traps that we tend to fall into, and I've definitely been guilty of it myself, is we think of people as objects to be changed. So if we make this regulation or if we nudge people this way, and it has a role, it is a tool in the toolbox, but that will only get you so far. The harder work is enabling people to be in a position where they are motivated to change for themselves. You can't force, it's like you can't force a child to act like an adult. You can't force somebody to see the world the way you want them to see. You can support them to grow towards that. But also we see this globally at the moment. When we're operating from a particular worldview, if we are struggling with something, if we're in crisis, we see the global recessions, we see a lot of political turmoil. When we're living in situations like that, we want security. Our natural instinct is to look, just psychologically, we need to feel safe. People are the sort of research now pointing to the fact that because we're then looking for sort of strong leaders, we're looking for somebody to tell us what the problem is and how they're going to fix it. Those are all characteristics of what we would call kind of the conformist worldview. And there are politicians who are absolutely good at exploiting that.
Yeah.
And making it sound like they have the answers. We see it in Eastern Europe. Saw it with Trump. And understandably, people want to feel that secure. They want to believe that there is a solution. So that's a huge challenge. because if we want people to be able to be open to change and to work towards those transformations, they need to feel secure. They need to feel secure financially, socially, psychologically. It goes back to what Tadhg says. All of these strands are important. It's not just about reducing the carbon emissions or increasing the energy efficiency. It's these human elements are actually really important in doing that. But it's difficult. Yeah, I don't have the answers, unfortunately. But it's also changing that mindset from looking at things from the lens of scarcity. That if there's enough for you, there mightn't be enough for me. That's very disempowering as well. And again, it's a narrative that certain people are happy to exploit. And we're seeing it with the refugee situation, apart from anything else. But again, it goes back to those narratives and whose interests are those narratives serving, and can we show a different narrative, particularly around that concept of well-being.
Thank you, Anne. That was the way you put that was so good and so eloquent. And you raised one point there, the cult of the strong leader is something I think we should be very aware of. You pointed it out in Eastern Europe, in Central Europe particularly, where people can make use of the disempowerment of other people to create some kind of power figure for themselves. We've seen where that ends. Need I say more? Thank you, Anne.
Maybe if I come in there just on Jack's point about how do we bring people with us, or how do we get that change? I think it's bottom up and top down processes. I don't think it really has a simple solution. You will require cultural change in the long term if you want people to be more cooperative and move away from competition. There's a lot of philosophical development that would say that cooperation is the fundamental that has driven technology, driven arts, driven culture, driven science, driven language, driven everything that basically defines humanity, that actually underpins a functioning market economy, funnily enough, because you need property rights and you need cooperation in terms of enforcing those and seeing them through, and reciprocity in terms of the relationship, a kind of a respect in terms of the transaction. So it's actually fundamental to economics, but we're not going to change that overnight. So you do need those bottom-up processes of participation to allow people's voices to be heard, but also places to where people can grow, because we have this somewhat of an atomization in terms of our approach to it, be it at the individual level, become more and more atomized from society and communities, and kind of top down. We have siloization in different government departments. So we will need bottom up and top down processes. We need to be really wary of politicians making hay out of doing things like blaming the victims in different situations. And I completely agree with that. In a democracy, well, the price is eternal of vigilance. That can happen, but we as a people can say we don't want this, and see how divisive and damaging and destructive it has been in other countries in recent years.
Thanks, Tadhg. I think there's one more. I think a lot of the comments have already been addressed, or the questions. Let me go back, Barbara. I don't think yours was addressed there. She says, it seems to me that you're both advocating for a second order way of seeing systems by emphasizing being part of the systems. How can this second order shift be made in practice beyond the fragmented and first order way of engineering systems out there? And what's the state of play on this in Ireland, in your view?
It's a really good question, because it also speaks to how we see the world and what we look for, in that at times in our lives, we need that sense of being part of a community, and that collective identity is really important. At other times, it's sort of, we sort of weave in and out of them. So sort of conformist worldview, we're all about the group. You look at any teenagers, all they want is their group. In our 20s, we tend to kind of be more into that individualistic, and we're looking to kind of express ourselves. It weaves back in again. And I think one of the things we're seeing at the moment is that there's a lot of call for collective action and for understanding our interconnections, and that we are one. And it's absolutely important to do that. But for certain people, that message just does not resonate because they feel that a threat to their own identity, which is centered around understanding themselves as this sort of separate individual. So it's being able to kind of bring those two together and not have that either or, that one is right and one is wrong. I see a lot of criticism from very well-meaning people at the moment who are looking at these alternative ways forwards and trying to transform, and they're saying we have to understand that we are one, and it's just going over people's heads, and in some places it's actually generating conflict, which is not helpful. In terms of designing and that second order thinking, there's a really nice way of translating the three spheres into kind of questions to ask or to answer when you're designing an action. And one is, with the personal thing, you start with saying, okay, give me a reason. So give me a motivation to do what you want me to do. If it's cycling, is it going to make me healthier? Is it going to save me money? Is it going to get me to work on time? You know, if you're going to do what you want to get people on the bike. So give me a reason. Show me other people doing it. I don't want to be the only one. The social thing is actually, social norms are really powerful in shifting people's behavior. No one wants to be the first. So that's kind of straddling the personal and the political systems thing. Make it easy for me to do this. Are there bike paths? Is there a place to have a shower at work? Can I store my bike? Can I bring my bike on the train? Can I bring my bike on the bus? Can I bring my kids to school with the bike? That's getting into the systems part of it, the political, how we design the systems to support the action. And then things like, show me how to do it. Maybe I haven't ridden a bike in 20 years. Can I have a fun way to learn how to do this? Can I afford to buy a bike? So it's drawing in those, it's putting the people kind of at the center and not just looking at them as you want to change their behavior, but you want to support them to make the choices that you feel are good choices. And you feel they're good choices because you've also asked them what they want, and you're not just telling them that it's a good choice. So that to me, it's moving from that emphasis that we saw in the diagram from knowledge and facts to a little bit more wisdom. And with wisdom, it requires reflection. It requires to admit you're wrong and to move on. And it's very difficult in the political context because politicians are judged on their performance. And maybe we as voters need to be a little bit more open and tolerant ourselves, and not to kind of beat them with a stick when something doesn't work. But that requires trust, which is a whole other aspect that we could talk about all day.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. That it just reminds me as well of, I think we're very afraid of making mistakes, and sometimes in this, you know, we're very much don't allow our politicians or people in power to make mistakes, whereas mistakes are needed to learn. You know, we can't get anywhere, especially with so many crises as we were talking about, that we need to just try things, and if they don't work, we need to try something else, and we need to, you know, there's no one solution, so we need to be able to try multiple solutions and see what works and what doesn't.
But we're not good at extending that generosity. No, but we're not good at extending that generosity to our policymakers. I mean, I worked in government myself, and there are so many people who really embody this idea of being a civil servant, that they are there to serve the public and are doing such good work. But it's so hard because you don't hear when you're getting it right, you hear when you're getting it wrong, which is not conducive to experimentation, shall we say.
I know, I hear you. I think Roger James has a couple of comments here. I don't know, Roger, not to put you on the spot. Do you want to come in and speak yourself, or I can just read out your comment there maybe?
We might think about the time as well. We have just 4 minutes. Sorry, Roger, I don't mean to speak over you, but we just have 4 minutes and I need a few minutes to wrap up. Is that okay?
Okay. Yeah, I posted the paper, which is worth everybody reading, about doomerism, because they were saying that doomerism isn't going to work, but what they call optimism and the ability to do things is. And so the real question I've got is there a missing component, a missing thing that we've not thought about? Because the adoption of cars was just so easy. And now you might say, and there was a comment that it was government policy, but there was more than that. You know, it enabled people who lived in villages to get into towns, and it spread the DNA pool far greater than the bicycle. So that was natural, and it was natural and aided and abetted by advertising. I just wonder if there's a missing component in this, that if thinking about the climate is a natural act, that structurally there's something we're not doing that makes people adopt bicycles or adopt walking to work in much the way that they adopt cars and whatever, as they have done.
I think that's a big question, Roger, and I think it might sort of cycle us into the next conversation, if you like. So we're recording this, so the question isn't lost. If Anne or Tadhg have got a very short, pithy answer to that one, then we can take it. And then for today, we might move to wrapping up, knowing that this is the start rather than the end. Sorry, Roger.
I would just offer that you have, it is that integrated nature. It's looking at the motivation, the support, the systems change in what, even with the smallest action that you're doing, if you're keeping those aspects in your head when you're designing and asking yourself, what am I missing? Whose voice am I not seeing here? Who do I need to talk to? It's getting out of those silos that we've been in for so long with making our policy, that we didn't talk to each other. We didn't talk to other policymakers, and we didn't talk to people on the ground. We didn't talk to different stakeholders. So it's I suppose humility is a good way to start, that we don't know everything.
Okay, thanks, Anne. Tadhg.
So very, very briefly to kind of expand on that a little bit, I'd say for thousands of years, spatial and transport planning were on what was walkable. For about 150 years, it was based on public transit. For about 50 to 60 years, depending on the country you're in, it's been based on cars. There were market reasons for that, including what happened in terms of advertising. There were personal reasons, but a lot of it was systems decisions that were centrally made that led us to that. So I don't think advertising can be completely blamed, or that it facilitated freedom. I'd say being stuck in congestion does not really contribute much to people's freedom. I think we can have enhanced mobility through different alternative pathways. I don't think that cars can claim that.
Sorry, I'm going to press pause for now rather than stop, because I'm very keen. Oh, the ecological context, John McHale. Thank you, Jack. It's 7:30 now. I have a penchant for not running over time. So let's wrap up for now. And please, if you haven't joined the mailing list, then please join the mailing list so we can let you know of the next event, which will be an Ireland-only SCiO members event. Alex and I are running a action learning session, and we'll be using the viable systems model, which I think is a really useful model as well. So do join us for any open meetings, any of our visitors from like Roger and Miguel and so on, but and Chris in South Africa. Brilliant. Wow. So and do stay in touch with us. Just to thank our speakers and everybody for coming. And this has been wonderful. And Tadhg, it will take a long time to unpack the density of what you've shared. We will share the recording, because I certainly will need to watch it at least 2 or 3 times more. And we will share the resources and the 2 papers that you refer to, as well as your PowerPoints. So I just want to thank you both, and thank Aisling for keeping us straight there on the questions throughout it all. So be in touch. And I just want to share one slide as we are saying our GRIOs, and it's for the recording, and I will stop the recording in a moment, but just to say these are the contact details for SCiO, for signing up, for emailing me through SCiO, for Tadhg, and for Anne. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing that, and I am going to stop recording. So thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, Joan. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much,
Dan and Tadhg. Thank you.